I came back from a week in Florida to find a "for sale" sign planted squarely in my front yard. At first, I thought it had to be some kind of mistake. Maybe the real estate company had meant to stick it next door. But the sign had my address printed clearly on the writer, bold black numbers on a white background. The strangest part was that my house didn't even look untouched. The lockbox on the front door was new, the kind realtors use for showings. I knew because I'd seen enough open houses in my neighborhood to recognize the setup. My porch light had been switched on, too, even though I never leave it running during the day. It gave me the unsettling feeling that someone had been inside while I was gone. I dropped my suitcase right there on the walkway and marched over to the sign. It was staked in deep, not just tossed there. I yanked at it, but the thing was wedged so firmly into the dirt that I couldn't pull it free. That's when I noticed the name of the listing agent. It was the same realtor my neighbor, Nancy, had used a few months earlier when she sold her rental property across the street. The whole situation hit me in waves. My house wasn't on the market. I hadn't spoken to a realtor. No one had permission to access my home. And yet, here was a lockbox and a sign telling the entire neighborhood otherwise. A few cars even slowed as they passed, as if they were curious buyers taking a look. I glanced at Nancy's place next door. Her blinds were cracked open just enough that I thought I saw movement. She had a way of being nosy about everyone else's business, but this was a whole different level. I couldn't shake the thought. Why would her realtor's name be on my yard sign? Was this some paperwork mix-up or something far stranger? I stood there, hands on my hips, trying to decide whether to call the realtor, the police, or just march up to Nancy's door and demand an explanation. I decided to start with the realtor. I pulled out my phone and dialed the number on the sign. A chipper voice answered. "This is Carol. Thanks for calling." I didn't waste time on pleasantries. I told her I was standing in front of my house, and that I wanted to know why she had it listed for sale. There was a pause, just long enough to feel deliberate. Then she said, "Well, I've been working with the seller. Are you saying you're not him?" My patience snapped. I gave her my full name and told her to check her paperwork. She stammered, saying something about how she would pull the file and get back to me. The way she said it sounded less like a mix-up and more like she'd been caught off guard. I hung up before she could backpedal further and stormed over to Nancy's porch. She opened the door almost before I knocked, like she'd been waiting. She had that polite smile people use when they're about to say something you won't like. I asked her point blank if she knew why my house was suddenly on the market. She tilted her head and said, "Oh, I thought you were selling. Carol mentioned she'd be handling another property on the street. I just assumed." Her voice was sweet, but her eyes flickered. It wasn't the look of someone caught in an innocent misunderstanding. I pressed her harder, asking how my address had gotten tangled up with her realtor. She shrugged, feigning confusion, and muttered something about clerical errors. Then she added, almost too casually, "You know, houses on this street are moving fast. If you ever did want to sell, now would be the time." That comment stuck with me as I walked back to my porch. I tried the front door and, sure enough, the knob felt different. The lock had been changed. My own key didn't fit anymore. I stood there in disbelief, holding the useless keyring in my hand. Someone had not only listed my house, but had also locked me out of it. For the first time, I felt a real surge of anger. This wasn't a mistake. Someone had taken actual steps to make it look like my home was for sale, and to keep me from getting inside. I wasn't about to stand on my own porch, locked out of my own home, like some stranger. I called the non-emergency police line and explained what had happened. The dispatcher sounded skeptical at first, but when I mentioned the lockbox and the changed locks, she said she'd send an officer to take a look. While I waited, I paced the yard. My suitcase still sat where I had dropped it earlier, and I could feel the eyes of passing neighbors on me. A couple walking their dog slowed down, glanced at the "for sale" sign, then at me, and kept moving without saying a word. It felt humiliating, like I was suddenly the outsider on my own street. When the officer arrived, I gave him the rundown. He tugged at the door, inspected the lockbox, and jotted notes in his little pad. "Looks like someone's treating this place as a listing," he said. I told him I hadn't signed anything, hadn't met with a realtor, hadn't authorized a thing. He asked for ID to prove I lived there. Luckily, my driver's license still had my current address, and I pulled out a utility bill from my suitcase. That seemed to satisfy him for the moment. The officer tried calling the realtor number on the sign. I could hear her voice faintly through the line, flustered again, promising to clear things up. He looked at me after he hung up and said, "I suggest you get a locksmith out here right away and reclaim your property. As for the sign, I'd leave it in the ground until this gets sorted. If you rip it up now, it could complicate things legally." It wasn't the clear solution I wanted, but at least it was something. I called a locksmith, who said it would take about an hour for him to arrive. In that gap of time, I stood guard on my front steps like I was protecting my territory. And then Nancy came strolling down her walkway with a casserole dish in hand. She offered it like some peace token, saying, "You must be exhausted from your trip. Thought you could use a warm meal." The timing was so odd, I couldn't help but wonder if she was trying to smooth something over or distract me from asking more questions. I didn't take the casserole. I just told Nancy I wasn't hungry and set it on the porch rail. She gave me that tight smile again and lingered like she wanted to say more. But then the officer stepped out from his cruiser and she quickly retreated back into her house. The whole exchange only deepened my suspicion that she was more involved than she let on. The locksmith showed up about 40 minutes later, a big guy with a van covered in decals. He got to work on the front door while I explained the situation. He whistled low when I told him about the realtor. "Never seen that one before," he muttered. "Locks usually get changed when a property's under contract, not out of the blue." It didn't take him long to pop the lock and swap in a new one. When he handed me the new keys, I felt a wave of relief. At least I had physical control again. But that relief faded the moment I stepped inside. The air was stale in a way it shouldn't have been after just a week away, and the faint smell of cleaning chemicals lingered. My throw pillows were stacked neatly on the couch instead of scattered the way I'd left them. Someone had definitely been in my house. I walked through every room, checking drawers, closets, even the fridge. Nothing obvious was missing, but it all felt staged, like a hotel room that had been prepared for guests. My dining table even had a vase of fresh flowers that I hadn't bought. The sight of it stopped me cold. When I came back outside, the officer was finishing up his notes. I told him what I'd seen inside. He nodded but didn't look surprised. "If they've been showing it, they probably cleaned and staged it. Still doesn't make it legal without your consent. You'll want to contact the realtor's office in writing, maybe even a lawyer." That word, lawyer, made the situation feel heavier. I had gone from vacation mode to thinking about legal fees in less than a day. And as I locked my door behind me, I saw Nancy watching from her window again, phone in hand, like she was documenting the whole thing. I spent the next morning drafting an email to the realtor's office. I kept it straightforward. My property was not for sale. I had not signed any listing agreement, and I expected them to remove the sign, the online listing, and any reference to my address immediately. I attached a scan of my deed for good measure. Within an hour, I got a reply, not from Carol, the agent I'd spoken to, but from a broker with her firm. He apologized for the confusion and said they'd investigate. He claimed there might have been clerical overlap with another property. I wasn't buying it. Clerical overlap didn't explain changed locks, staged furniture, or strangers walking through my kitchen. I decided to check online myself. A quick search pulled up the listing on 3 major real estate sites. Sure enough, there were photos of my house, interior and all. My living room, my bedroom, even my backyard with the old grill I kept meaning to replace. The captions read like any other sales pitch. "Charming 3-bedroom with updated fixtures and plenty of natural light." My stomach turned as I clicked through. Dozens of strangers had already seen the inside of my life. That was when I realized I needed legal help. I called a local real estate attorney, explained the situation, and set up a meeting for later that afternoon. His assistant sounded intrigued, like this wasn't the kind of case they heard every day. While waiting, I walked the neighborhood just to clear my head. A couple of houses down, one neighbor stopped me and asked if I was really moving. She said she'd seen people touring my place 2 days ago. They'd even parked in her driveway when they couldn't find space on the street. She thought it was odd that I hadn't mentioned selling, but assumed I wanted to keep it quiet. Hearing that made it all real in a way the online photos hadn't. People had been inside my home, walking through rooms I considered private, opening closets, maybe even commenting on my taste in furniture. By the time I got back to my porch, my anger had turned into something sharper, resolve. I wasn't just going to get the sign pulled. I wanted to know exactly who had put it there, and why Nancy's fingerprints were all over the situation. The attorney's office was in a converted brick building downtown, the kind with creaky floors and diplomas lining every wall. When I met with him, I laid out the whole story: the sign, the lockbox, the staged flowers, the online listing. He listened without interrupting, occasionally jotting something in his notebook. When I finished, he leaned back in his chair and said, "This isn't a clerical error. This is either negligence or outright fraud." He explained that for a property to be listed, someone had to sign paperwork, signatures, IDs, disclosures. It wasn't something that just accidentally happened. If Carol had listed my house, she either had forged documents or she had been misled by someone claiming to be me. Either way, it was serious. He recommended I send a formal cease and desist letter immediately, and he offered to draft it for me. I agreed, and while he got to work, I asked him what kind of person could pull this off. He shrugged and said, "Could be a scammer trying to collect deposits. Could be someone hoping to force a sale and flip the house. Sometimes it's even a neighbor with too much time on their hands." That last part didn't feel hypothetical. By the time I left, I had copies of the letter ready to be delivered to the brokerage. I also had advised to document everything: photos of the sign, the lockbox, the flowers, even statements from neighbors who had seen strangers inside. He told me, "The more you gather, the stronger your position if this ends up in court." When I got home, I snapped photos of everything, making sure to timestamp them. Then I walked over to the listing sign again and studied it more closely. There was a little plastic holder attached to it with paper flyers. I pulled one out and froze. The contact sheet listed an open house, scheduled for the following Sunday, at my address, with a time window already set. That was when it clicked. This wasn't just some clerical hiccup waiting to be cleared. Someone had made plans to invite half the town into my home like it was theirs to sell. I took the flyer inside, snapped photos of it, and sent everything to my attorney. He called me back within minutes. His plan was simple: hit the brokerage from every angle at once. Cease and desist served in person, complaint filed with the MLS, and written notice that any entry would be treated as trespass. He told me to make my boundaries visible too, so I printed a bold sign for the front door: "Private property, not for sale, no showings, authorized occupant on site." I stuck another on the lockbox for good measure and mounted a spare doorbell camera I'd been meaning to install. If someone tried the door now, I'd have it on video. Then I called Carol again. I told her about the letter and the MLS complaint. She fell back on corporate phrases: "our understanding," documented authorization, third-party access, and for the first time used a term that made my jaw clench: property manager. I asked who that was. She said she couldn't disclose a client's information without permission. I said, "You're selling my house." She said, "We have paperwork." I told her I'd like to see it. She suggested I speak with the broker, so I drove to their office. The lobby was all brushed metal and staged succulents, the kind of place that makes you feel like the problem, not the client. The broker met me with a concerned smile, offered water, and said they were pausing marketing activities. While they reviewed, I asked to see the file. He said legal had advised against it, but he slipped and said one detail he shouldn't have. Their intake contact was a neighbor listed as access coordinator. My neighbor. I didn't say Nance's name. I didn't have to. Back home, the doorbell camera pinged almost immediately. A photographer stood on my stoop with a tripod and a wide-angle lens bag. He said he was there for Twilight Exteriors. I told him the listing was unauthorized. He looked genuinely confused and showed me his text instructions. The thread had the lockbox code, my address, and a note: "If any issues, neighbor Nancy can let you in." I asked if I could take a photo of that screen. He shrugged and held it steady. Proof. I forwarded the screenshot to the broker and my attorney. Within an hour, the online listing switched from active to temporarily withdrawn. The broker emailed a careful apology about mixed signals and miscommunication between parties, promising no further showings. I still taped a second warning sign to the fence and texted 2 nearby neighbors to spread the word. I wanted anyone cruising the street for an appointment to hit a wall of reality. At dusk, a couple in business casual walked up my path with a printout in hand. They were apologetic and said they had a private showing set through Nancy at 6. I told them plainly the house wasn't for sale and suggested they call their agent. As they turned, I saw Nancy on her driveway, phone to her ear, giving a little wave like this was all a scheduling hiccup. The couple hesitated, glancing between us. That's when I realized Sunday's open house wasn't the main event. It was just one piece of a machine that had already been running. The next morning, I called my attorney again and told him about the couple who'd shown up with Nance's name on their paperwork. He didn't sound surprised. "That makes her more than a nosy neighbor," he said. "That makes her an active participant. We need to figure out her motive." He suggested I pull property records to see if there was any connection, liens, easements, anything that might explain why she'd want my house on the market. So I headed down to the county recorder's office. It was the kind of place with fluorescent lights buzzing overhead and endless rows of file cabinets. After an hour of digging through digital archives with the help of a clerk, I found nothing unusual on my end, just the deed in my name, mortgage recorded, taxes current. But then I pulled up Nance's property file. That's when things clicked. She had refinanced her place twice in the last 5 years and had a home equity line open with a balance that looked substantial. The clerk pointed out a foreclosure notice that had been filed last month, though not finalized. Walking out of that office, I could piece together a rough picture. Nancy needed cash badly. Maybe she thought she could push me into selling, get her realtor buddy a quick commission, and boost the comps on the block. A higher sale price on my house could raise the market value of hers, making her refinance easier. Or maybe she was planning something even messier, like steering buyers to her place after they were lured in by mine. When I got back to my street, Nancy was out front trimming her rose bushes. She gave me a neighborly wave, as if nothing was happening. I couldn't bring myself to wave back. My phone buzzed with an email from the brokerage, this time from their legal team, saying they were withdrawing representation from any party connected to my address. It was corporate speak for backing away before the fire got hotter. But that didn't solve my problem. Nancy wasn't just testing the waters. She was invested enough to hand out my lockbox code, to host walkthroughs, to keep the illusion alive. If she was bold enough to do all that in broad daylight, I had to wonder what else she might be willing to try once the open house she'd advertised fell apart. By Saturday evening, I had enough of watching Nancy wave from her driveway like none of this mattered. My attorney told me not to confront her directly, but I couldn't just sit back. Instead, I decided to prepare. I printed copies of the withdrawal notice from the brokerage and taped one to the front door right under my warning sign. I left another on the "for sale" sign in my yard. If anyone still showed up, they couldn't claim ignorance. Sure enough, the next day, Sunday, the supposed open house, cars started slowing down in front of my house around noon. Most kept driving after spotting the signs, but one silver SUV pulled right into Nance's driveway. A family of 4 got out, holding the same flyer I had found earlier. Nancy walked out to greet them, smiling and gesturing toward my place. That was it. I walked straight over. I told the family, calmly, that my house was not for sale and that the listing had been pulled. They looked embarrassed and piled back into their SUV without another word. Nancy, though, looked furious. Her smile dropped the second they were gone. She hissed, "You didn't have to embarrass me like that." I shot back, "You've been trespassing on my life for weeks. Consider it returned." That evening, I sent my attorney a full report with photos of Nancy ushering people toward my yard. He said it was time to escalate. The next step wasn't just a cease and desist to the brokerage. It was a restraining order against Nancy herself. He explained that with the evidence we gathered, including the photographer's text messages and the doorbell footage, a judge would likely grant it. Filing meant things would get public. Our quiet street would see both of our names on a docket, and there was no way to keep that discreet. But after weeks of intrusion, humiliation, and strangers peeking through my windows, I wasn't worried about keeping it quiet anymore. The paperwork went in Monday morning. That night, I noticed Nance's blinds stayed tightly shut for the first time since I'd gotten back from vacation. The court date came quickly. I sat in the small municipal courtroom with my attorney, clutching a folder stuffed with printouts, the flyers, the screenshots, the photos of strangers on my porch. Nancy walked in wearing a pale blue suit that looked a size too stiff for her. She avoided my eyes, but when the judge asked why we were there, her voice was sharp. She claimed she had been helping a friend's relative coordinate a sale, and that any confusion was the realtor's fault. My attorney laid out the evidence piece by piece: the lockbox code text naming Nancy, the photographer's note, the couple who had shown up at my door saying she had scheduled them. The judge leaned back and asked Nancy if she had authorization from me to handle anything related to my property. She admitted she did not. The restraining order was granted on the spot. Nancy was barred from stepping onto my property or representing herself as connected to it in any way. The judge warned her that further interference could lead to criminal charges. I felt a strange mix of relief and disbelief as the gavel came down. The ordeal that had started with a sign in my yard now had an official end. Back home, the sign was finally gone, pulled out by the brokerage after my attorney leaned on them one last time. I unlocked my own door, stepped inside, and for the first time since my trip, the place felt like mine again. The flowers were wilted, the air had lost that chemical smell, and the house carried only the weight of my own presence. Neighbors asked questions in the days that followed, but I didn't bother going into detail. Some probably knew more than they admitted. Nancy kept to herself, blinds drawn, her once busy driveway empty. The whole experience taught me something simple but sobering. Your home isn't just four walls. It's a claim you have to defend, sometimes against people you'd least expect. And for me, that defense started with refusing to let someone else decide when my life was for sale.